But actually, there's been a change of plans. I'm actually going to talk about, if I can get my slides to advance, how to pronounce Ratio Christi. So, yeah, there's some confusion on this.
Latin sounds more
snooty.
But if you have trouble spelling or saying that,
they're simple Latin words.
Reference anybody? Yes, thank you. Somebody got the reference. All right. It's a random clip from Adventures in Honesty. So yes, things Ratio Christi has been called that I've heard with my own ears. It's usually people trying to like recall our name, having once heard it, but don't quite remember what it is. So we have this classic, Ratio Christ. But this one's a little bit forgivable because I think it was just like an autocorrect thing where somebody's phone or computer didn't know what to do with Christi, so it corrected it to Christ. But it made it on the local news.
Is suing the University of Nebraska Lincoln. The group is called Ratio Christ.
So, for those of you who don't know what that is, that was a couple years ago when UNL basically decided to reject our request to have a speaker speak on campus over ideological disagreements, and then they ended up admitting they were wrong in what they did. But anyway, so that one made it on the news. But other names I've heard, we have Ratio Crystal. So also an easy confusion, that's actually our other group that meets at 10:30. We talk about New Age spirituality and get hyped up on psychedelic drugs. So if you want to join us for that time, it's also really fun. Same room, yeah. So just to be clear, Ratio Christi does not endorse drug use, except the ones that Clark sells. So anyway, the joke is he works in a pharmacy, yes, okay. All right. Ratio Christi, another favorite one there. We have Ra Christio. Now I know that's like instead of like reason of Christ, that's like Christ within reason or something, I don't know. And then of course my all-time favorite, Rashi Krishna. And that one made it into a hearing transcript, so yes. All right, that exists on a government website somewhere, go find it. All right, so actually no, we're talking about, did God really say objections to the moral argument? And yes, with this slide, I do intend to imply that anybody who objects to the moral argument is literally Satan. So, not really. But we're continuing on last week when Lance talked to us about what the moral argument is and defended its premises. And so this week we're going to respond to some of the objections that people raise against the moral argument. But first, a bit of review. So, the moral argument, there's a bunch of forms, but we kind of talked about two main forms last week. One was the deductive version, popularized by William Lane Craig, among others. There's William Lane Craig.
I mean, the sort of professional debaters on behalf of religion, people like William Craig, I've no time for him. I mean, he's got this sort of loud, rather pompous voice, and he says premise 1, deduction 2, and things like that. And
so, yeah. Anyway. Premise 1, objective moral values and duties do exist. Premise 2, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. So therefore, those little 3 dots mean God exists. We can call that deduction 1. And if you're wondering why premise is spelled with 2 S's, that's actually an acceptable alternate spelling that William Lane Craig prefers. So there you go. There's also an abductive version. Abductive just meaning like inference to the best explanation, kind of popularized by David Baggett and Jerry Walls. That goes like this. There is objective moral truth. Premise 2, the best explanation for how and why there is objective moral truth is the existence of God. Therefore, we have good reason to believe that God exists. So you notice that this version is not as airtight as the deductive version, but it contains kind of a weaker premise. So premise 2 in the abductive version is a little bit weaker than the premise 2 in the deductive version. And that's just because it's a little easier to defend when you're talking about best explanations and good reasons rather than if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties cannot exist. Though, I'll try to make that argument tonight. We'll call that deduction 2. So the first thing I'm going to look at is what I've called objection by difficult example, or objection by insane hypothetical. That's just kind of my own term that I gave it, but it goes something like this, right? We've all seen these classic moral dilemmas, right? So like here's the trolley problem, right? You know, do you pull the lever and make the trolley divert and then run over one person, or let it go over 5 people and do nothing? Like, what's the morally correct thing to do in that situation? But have you heard of the infinite trolley problem? This problem, you have the choices of, do you pull the lever, killing 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 people, resulting in infinite people dying? Or do you do nothing, allowing the trolley to infinitely kill 100 continuously reincarnating people? In both cases, there is infinite suffering, but in the top case, there is finite suffering for each infinite death, whereas in the bottom case, there's infinite suffering for each finite death. So what do you do? So the point is not actually to focus on that trolley problem specifically. It's kind of a hilarious example of these insane moral conundrums that people bring up as to like why there might not be objective morality, or why God can't be the source of morality because there's all these difficult moral dilemmas. And so, yeah, we can acknowledge that there is moral disagreement in our world. There's difficult cases. The right moral answer is not always clear. But there's also tremendous agreement. And in fact, that's why the picture of C.S. Lewis is over there, because in The Abolition of Man, he did a good job of cataloging a bunch of different cultural descriptions of morality where there was actually a lot of commonality and agreement. So he gives example of moral agreement from like the Bible, the Quran, the Analects of Confucius, Hindu, Buddhist, Egyptian writings, Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, Norse writings, etc., showing that even though there is some significant disagreement, there's actually a huge core of things that a lot of cultures all over the world, different times and different places, did in fact agree on. So then the question is, what best explains this broad agreement in basic moral values among humans of different cultures and times? Right? Is this better explained on the theory that morality is merely subjective, that our intuitions of objective right and wrong are just illusions that can vary widely from person to person and culture to culture? So is the fact that there is moral agreement best explained by this kind of subjectivist, person-based approach? Or is the evidence of broad mutual moral agreement among cultures better explained on the theory that objective moral values, independent of any human being or culture, do in fact exist? Does that best explain why a bunch of cultures do agree on a significant moral core? So of course, in these difficult cases, exceptions or hard cases don't necessarily disprove general rules, right? You can always find hard cases, but that doesn't always mean that the rule, the general rule, is incorrect. Also, moral disagreement is actually pointless, as Lance pointed out last week, if there isn't something to actually disagree about. So even though there's these hard cases, arguing about what to do in these hard cases, if there is no objective morality, becomes a pointless exercise. Just because something is difficult to know doesn't mean that there isn't a right or objective answer. So, for example, the correct scientific theory for lots of phenomena has been revised many times. Right? It's difficult to know the right answer, but disagreement over, which scientific theory correctly describes gravity, which scientific theory correctly describes quantum effects, right? Disagreement doesn't mean that there isn't a correct answer or isn't an objective reality out there. It just means that we are unsure of what it is. Or a fancy way of saying that is like moral ontology, right? What is can still be real, while moral epistemology, how we know what it is, can be difficult. So that's kind of how I would respond to kind of this objection that gets brought up, usually more on a popular level of just kind of, hey, look at this difficult case. That means that morality can't be objective and that God can't be its source. Usually there's more going on beneath the surface, and moral disagreement doesn't indicate that there is no objective morality at all. So now the Euthyphro dilemma, the literally age-old objection. So we're going to kind of go through what this is and where it came from a bit, because I think it's kind of interesting to see the background of it. So where did the Euthyphro dilemma come from? Well, it came from Socrates.
Heretinos o Socrates, relegate, met de melo margar Socrates. De los saste Socrates.
Socrates. Hey, we know that name. Yeah. Hey, look him up. Oh, it's under Socrates. Oh, yeah. Socrates. The only true wisdom consists in knowing that you know nothing. That's us, dude. Oh, yeah. Let's bag him. Yeah.
So that comes from a movie, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, right, where these high school students kidnap historical figures for their history project using a time machine. Anyway, so I thought that was funny. It says, look under Socrates, 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 right? Okay, so Socrates, the Greek philosopher, is waiting for trial at the porch of the king magistrate of Athens. Euthyphro, another person of Prospalta, is also there to prosecute his father for the murder of someone his father had hired to farm for him. So there's these two characters kind of outside of this courthouse, if you will, or this palace, and they're going to start in a dialogue here, and that's what's going to lead to the Euthyphro dilemma. So Socrates and Euthyphro begin to talk, and Socrates begins asking Euthyphro about why he's there and if he's sure about what he's doing, aka, are you sure you should be prosecuting your father? And now we can kind of drop in on this dialogue a little bit. So you mean he's prosecuting his father after all. So, Euthyphro says, they say that I ought not take any notice, for that a son is impious who prosecutes a father, which shows, Socrates, how little they know what the gods think about piety and impiety. So a couple things off the bat. First of all, they're going to use these words piety and impiety and pious and impious a lot. You could almost just kind of replace those in your mind with right and wrong, right? It's just kind of more of a different way of talking. They're talking about like what pleases the gods. Remember, this is an ancient Greek context, so you'll see a lot of that terminology in here, but just think when you see impious and pious, think wrong and right. So Socrates says, good heavens, Euthyphro, and is your knowledge of religion and of things pious and impious so very exact that supposing the circumstances to be as you state them, you are not afraid lest you too may be doing an impious thing and bringing an action against your father? He continues, therefore, I adjure you, tell me the nature of piety and impiety, which you said that you knew so well, and of murder and of other offenses against the gods. What are they? Is not piety in every action always the same? And impiety, again, is it not always the opposite of piety, and also the same with itself, having as impiety one notion which includes whatever is impious? Lots of jumbly words there. Basically, he's just saying, like, hey, what actually is piety and impiety? What is right and wrong? You say that you're right to prosecute your father. Other people say you might be wrong to do that. But Socrates is kind of going a little deeper, like, what is right and wrong? And Euthyphro just says, to be sure, Socrates. So Socrates presses a little bit further. He says, and what is piety and what is impiety? And Euthyphro says, piety is doing as I am doing. That is to say, prosecuting anyone who is guilty of murder, sacrilege, or of any similar crime, whether he be your father or mother or whoever he may be, that makes no difference, and not to prosecute them is impiety. But Socrates says, well, remember, I did not ask you to give me 2 or 3 examples of piety, but to explain the general idea which makes all things pious to be pious. So he's saying, like, look, I'm not saying describe what right things to do are. Tell me what makes these things right. Like, what is rightness itself? That's kind of the genius of Socrates, right? He's probing these deep questions. He wants to get below the surface and figure out what's really driving the thoughts that are taking place. So he continues, do you not recollect that there was one idea which made the impious impious and the pious pious? Euthyphro says, I remember. Socrates says, tell me what is the nature of this idea, and then I shall have a standard to which I may look, and by which I may measure actions, whether yours or those of anyone else, and then I shall be able to say that such and such an action is pious, such another impious. So he's basically like, hey, show me the standard of what makes something right or wrong, and then I can know, right? Then I can point to that and measure every other action by that standard, but what is the standard? And Euthyphro says, I will tell you if you like. And Socrates says, I should very much like. So Euthyphro says, piety then is that which is dear to the gods, and impiety is that which is not dear to them. So Socrates pushes a little bit further. He says, well, come on, and let us examine what we are saying. That thing or person which is dear to the gods is pious, and that thing or person which is hateful to the gods is impious, these two being the extreme opposites of one another. Was that not said? And Euthyphro says it was. And Socrates says, and was it well said? And Euthyphro says, yes, Socrates, I thought so. It was certainly said. And Socrates says, and further, Euthyphro, the gods were admitted to have enmities and hatreds and differences, right? So see where Socrates is going? He got Euthyphro to say what he wanted, right? That, you know, things that are right and wrong depend on the gods, but then Socrates is going to be like, here's the error of polytheism. You have multiple gods, and they might disagree with one another. They might actually fight with each other, as we know in Greek mythology they do. He says, yes, that was also said. So then Socrates says, they have differences of opinion, as you say, about good and evil, just and unjust, honorable and dishonorable. There would have been no quarrels among them if there had been no such differences. Would there now? And Euthyphro says, you are quite right. And Socrates says, does not every man love that which he deems noble and just and good and hate the opposite of them? Euthyphro, very true. Socrates then says, but as you say, people regard the same things, some as just and others as unjust. About these they dispute, and so there arise wars and fightings among them. Very true. Socrates says, then the same things are hated by the gods and loved by the gods and are both hateful and dear to them, right? He's kind of pointing out the fundamental flaw here in Euthyphro's idea. Euthyphro says, true. He doesn't seem to realize the import of what's being said. So then Socrates pushes, he says, and upon this view, the same things, Euthyphro, will be pious and also impious? So I should suppose. Socrates then says, okay, well, wait a minute. Do you realize what you've just said? He says, then my friend, I remark with surprise that you have not answered the question which I asked. For I certainly did not ask you to tell me what action is both pious and impious, but now it would seem that what is loved by the gods is also hated by them. But I will amend the definition so far as to say that what all the gods hate is impious, and what they love, pious or holy, and what some of them love and others hate is both or neither. Shall this be our definition of piety and impiety? So Socrates helps Euthyphro out. He's not getting the point. So Socrates is like, I'm going to amend the definition and say, maybe it's what all the gods agree is good. That's what's right. And what all the gods agree is wrong. That's what's wrong. So there we go. So Euthyphro says, why not, Socrates? And Socrates says, why not? Certainly, as far as I am concerned, Euthyphro, there is no reason why not. But whether this admission will greatly assist you in the task of instructing me as you promised is a matter for you to consider. So Socrates is a little bit sly. He's still got something up his sleeve with which to present to Euthyphro. So Euthyphro says, yes, I should say that what all the gods love is pious and holy, and the opposite, which is all they hate, impious. So he's just walked right into Socrates' trap. Because Socrates says, we know better, my good friend, in a little while. The point which I should first wish to understand is whether the pious is holy, whether the pious or holy is beloved by the gods because it is holy, or holy because it is beloved of the gods. That is the Euthyphro dilemma statement. And Euthyphro says, I don't understand your meaning, Socrates. So he's still, missing the point. And Socrates says, and what do you say of piety, Euthyphro? Is not piety, according to your definition, loved by all the gods? And Euthyphro says, yes. And Socrates says, because it is pious or holy, or for some other reason? And Euthyphro says, no, that is the reason. So Socrates says, is loved because it is holy, not holy because it is loved? And Euthyphro says, yes. And so Socrates says, and that which is dear to the gods is loved by them, and is in a state to be loved of them because it is loved of them? And Euthyphro says, certainly. But Socrates detects a problem here, right? He says, but friend Euthyphro, if that which is holy is the same with that which is dear to God and is loved because it is holy, then that which is dear to God would have been loved as being dear to God. Translation, this is a circular claim. So Socrates is pointing out kind of the error in Euthyphro's reasoning here. So he kind of walked him into this trap. Euthyphro agreed, and then Socrates is like, gotcha, that's the error here in this way of thinking. And he goes on. But if that which is dear to God is dear to him because it is loved by him, then that which is holy would have been holy because it is loved by him. And therefore, if you please, I will ask you not to hide your treasure, but to tell me once more, a little bit of sarcasm dripping there, what holiness or piety really is, whether dear to the gods or not, and what is impiety. And at this point, Euthyphro just kind of gives up. He says, I really do not know, Socrates, how to express what I mean, for somehow or other our arguments, on whatever ground we rest them, seem to turn around and walk away from us. So Euthyphro is left in this state. Meanwhile, Socrates. So, all right, so what is the dilemma, right? Going back to that famous line that Socrates utters. Socrates wants to know whether the pious or holy is beloved by the gods because it is holy, or holy because it is beloved of the gods. In more modern terms, do the gods love something because it is good, or is something good because it is loved by the gods? If we translate this even further into Judeo-Christian formulation with a single, monotheistic God, does God command something because it is good, or is something good because God commands it? That's often how you'll hear the Euthyphro dilemma phrase today. That is the dilemma. Why is it a dilemma? Well, because embracing either horn or either option in this dilemma seems to be bad, right? If God commands something because it is good, that would seem to mean that there is some standard of good that is outside God, right? So this standard of good, whatever it is telling God what he has to command. So then is he really God? This would challenge his attribute that's sometimes known as aseity, meaning his self-existence. He exists before everything else. By him, everything came into being. So if that's the case, where is this standard of good outside of God that's telling him what he has to command? On the other side, though, if something is good because God commands it, then couldn't God command anything he wants, right? The implication being that wouldn't that make good arbitrary based on whatever God decides to do? Could God just declare one day that murder is actually good? And you'll have some people even press the objection further if you look at certain difficult texts in the Old Testament, like, did he actually do this, right? And that's a whole topic for another speech. We've talked about that before, but that's kind of where some of this leads. Okay, so how do we solve Socrates' dilemma in this case? Because Socrates is the one who came up with it. Euthyphro just kind of blindly went along agreeing with Socrates until he got stuck in the trap and then couldn't reason his way out. But does God command something because it is good, or is something good because God commands it? Well, one way we can respond to that dilemma is to reject it as a false dichotomy, meaning there's a third option, there's another choice. We don't have to choose one or other of those things. So maybe there's a third option, and that third option would be that morality isn't good because God commands it. God doesn't command morality because good exists external to him, but the third option would be rather God's unchanging moral nature, the substance of who he is itself the standard of goodness, and he commands things in accordance with that. That's kind of a fundamental part of what's sometimes called divine command theory, which is one of the main proponents of that would be a guy named Robert Adams. So he's kind of one of the main philosophical proponents of this idea that God's moral nature is what informs his commands. So his unchanging moral nature is what determines what good is. It's not outside of God, it's internal to God. So So here's a quote from Robert Adams. He says, "The part played by God in my account of the good is similar to that of the form of the beautiful or the good in Plato. God is the supreme good, and the goodness of other things consists in a sort of resemblance to God." So God himself is the standard in terms of himself, and he commands consistently with that standard. So his commands are not arbitrary. They're consistent with his internal, good, unchanging moral nature. But we can actually be a little bit more precise. Recall premise 1. Objective moral values and duties do exist. And notice how that's phrased by William Lane Craig very specifically there. Values and duties. So moral value is actually like the moral quality of something or some action. We can actually distinguish it from moral duties. So like, moral value, is it good or bad? Is something morally good or morally bad to do? It's kind of the is of morality, if you want to state it that way. Whereas moral obligations or moral duties could be differentiated as the requirement that someone do something morally good and refrain from doing something morally bad. So there's obligation involved. It's not really asking is it good or bad, but is it right or wrong for me to do? The ought of morality. So like the moral value kind of expresses the is of morality, what is good or bad, and moral obligation talks about what we ought to do, what is right or wrong. So our first discussion question then is, okay, moral value versus moral obligation. We just made that distinction, but aren't we obligated to do what's morally good and obligated to not do what's morally bad? So, all right, so this is kind of the one question, right? Shouldn't we just do everything that's good and not do everything that's bad? Sort of, right? Isn't it right to do what's good and wrong to do what's bad? Another way to say that. Actually, no. Things can be good to do that are not obligatory. So in the way I've differentiated moral value and moral duties in the way most people do, there can actually be things that are morally good, but things that we are not required to do. So what would be an example of that? One of the classic ones is like donate to charity, right? That's a morally good thing to do. But at least in some cases, we're not always required to do that, right? You can kind of think of how that would be the case, right? It's a morally good thing to do, but it's not always obligatory. So sometimes this is given a fancy term in philosophical land called supererogation, which means going above and beyond what is required, doing morally good things above and beyond what we are commanded to do or what we are obligated to do. Things can also be bad to do that are not necessarily proscribed or prohibited. One example of this could be, like in the Christian sense, divorce, right? Divorce is bad, but there are certain cases, right, that were permitted because of, like as Jesus says, the hardness of their hearts, right? That doesn't make that divorce good, but it makes it permitted because we live in a fallen, sinful world. We don't have ideal circumstances, and so you could kind of argue that divorce is one of those things, though, while morally bad, is not always something we should not do. So I threw out this term earlier, but this kind of becomes known as divine command theory. This is one of the theistic ways to explain how God is the source of morality. There's actually more, but this is one kind of popular one. It's the one that I hold to, so I'm going to rely on it a lot. So basically, where do our moral obligations come from? Divine command theory would say God, right? Our moral obligations come from God, specifically from his commands. They also come from William Lane Craig and your mom. The idea of obligations is personal, right? If I'm obligated to something, then I'm obligated to someone else to do that thing, right? So obligations usually, I would argue, only make sense in the context of a person or being to which we are obligated. So God's nature exemplifies moral value, right? And God's commands generate our moral obligations to live in accordance with God's moral value. So there's kind of a fight within Christian meta-ethics, meaning explaining how ethics or explaining how morality actually functions, that's the philosophical term, between what's called divine command theory and natural law theory. I'm just going to kind of ignore natural law theory because I don't hold to it, but it's also another alternate system. If you want to go look into that and all the ways that it sets up this structure, you can, but I'm going to kind of ignore it tonight. So returning to the Euthyphro dilemma then, if we state the dilemma in terms of moral value, does God command something because it is good, or is something good because God commands it? If we're strictly talking about moral value, we can actually embrace the first horn. God commands something because it is good, with the caveat that goodness is grounded in God's nature. It's not external to God, it's internal to God. It's part of who he is. If we state the dilemma in terms of moral obligations, right, does God command something because it is right, or is something right because God commands it, right? Right meaning something I should or should not, should do, right? We can embrace the second horn, right? Something is right because God commands it, right? On divine command theory, God's commands are what generates our moral obligations. And this kind of delineation goes back to the philosopher, I mentioned him already, David Baggett. So there's kind of a little more precise. If we define terms a little more carefully, we can actually kind of split the Euthyphro dilemma into two and actually accept one in terms of moral value and the other horn in terms of moral obligation. And then we have kind of a self-consistent solution that doesn't actually fall prey to either dilemma. So, in this case, if we solve the dilemma then, God commands something because it is good, right? Because goodness is grounded in God's nature. This means that goodness is not something external to God, that is above God and would then require an explanation for its own existence, right? Something is right because God commands it. God's commands are what generate our moral obligations. This means that our obligations arise when God commands us to do or not to do something that is morally good or bad, respectively. His commands are consistent with his nature, and thus they are not arbitrary. So that's kind of how we get out of the Euthyphro dilemma. You can either reject it as a false dichotomy, or you can very carefully delineate what we're actually talking about, moral value and moral obligations, and then embrace the horns on the other side of that without actually falling prey to one of the bad options that people would have you think is going to happen if you embrace one of the horns of the dilemma. So, age-old problem, like I said, it goes all the way back to Socrates and Euthyphro, back in Plato's dialogues, before Jesus Christ, right, ancient Greece, still being discussed today, and I think that's kind of one of the best solutions that Christian philosophers today have come up with, is that divine command theory solution. So, objection number 3, isn't God a subject, or also known as let's play semantic games? So wait, somebody might say, is morality objective or subjective? Well, God, I just argued, is a personal being, right? He's not just kind of an inanimate object. He's not some abstract object or some force. He's a personal being. That's what I'm arguing. Well, a personal being, right, is a subject, someone who does things. So if morality is grounded in God, and God is a subject, then doesn't that make morality subjective, right? Because we would say that morality is subjective if it's grounded in like human beings and our own thoughts and opinions and cultures. But how does that not apply to God? If objective morality is morality that is mind independent, that's another kind of definition some people use, then it doesn't depend on what people think. Then how can morality that depends on God's mind or his moral nature be considered mind independent and thus objective? So that's kind of the objection that's put forth. Well, there's a sense in which this is just a labeling game. It isn't really that important how we classify the belief that God is the source of morality. What matters is whether this is actually how things are, whether God actually is the source of morality. That's really what matters, not how we want to label it as subjective or objective. But we could end up, so it kind of ends up just being semantics in some point, right? It's just like, do we label it as subjective or objective based on some kind of specific and technical definition? But we can also press further and realize that this kind of misses the point of God being a different type of being than human beings. Like, that's the Christian claim. God isn't just another being like us, right? The only reason subjective morality is problematic is that there are many human beings, we are all fallible, and no one is inherently better than any other human being, right? So that kind of means morality depends on us, then who's to say, right? That's kind of the problem with subjectivist theories of morality. So if morality depends on human beings, then no one can really tell anyone else what to do, right, in kind of a simplistic sense. However, we can properly call morality that depends on God objective morality because it is objective with respect to human beings, like with respect to us. As far as we're concerned, that's objective because we can't change it. It doesn't depend on what we think. So it's independent of any human mind. That's what it means to be objective in this sense, right? God is the type of being of whom there is only one. He is infallible, and he is inherently better than us, right? So there's kind of this, God is a very different being. So to base morality on him doesn't make it subjective in the same way as morality being based on us would make it subjective, I would argue. And even if God were to change his mind on morality, it would still be set independently of human beings. And thus, as far as we're concerned, it would still be objective, right? So, even if God were to change his mind on some moral command, it would still be, as far as we're concerned, objective because it doesn't depend on us. Right? We can still point to a standard, even if that standard hypothetically could shift. So that's why I think that well, isn't God a subject, doesn't that make morality subjective argument, is really kind of just a semantic labeling game and kind of misses the point of who God is with respect to who we are. So some of you may know Adam Johnson with Convincing Proof here in Lincoln, and he said this about this objection. He says, it seems to me the deeper objection that's being made here by those who push back against the moral argument with this kind of reasoning is that if God is the source of morality, then that would make morality as arbitrary and fluid as it would be if morality were dependent on how humans think. In other words, they're arguing that if God were the source of morality, then moral truth wouldn't be fixed and unchanging because God could change it to be whatever he wanted it to be, or he could have chosen for it to have been radically different from what it currently is. If I'm correct that this is the deeper objection being made, then this objection is merely a restating of the famous Euthyphro dilemma, right? You kind of see that, right? How if that's really the concern with people making this, morality is subjective because it's based on God, there's kind of that fear of arbitrariness, and that kind of goes back to the Euthyphro dilemma, where we kind of said, like, no, right? It's not arbitrary because it's based on his unchanging moral nature. That's what his commands are based on. So in one sense, this objection kind of also just collapses back into the Euthyphro dilemma. Another objection that sometimes you'll hear concerns the meaning of the word ought, right? Or moral obligations are a mere mirage. And what do people who say this mean? Well, what do you mean by I ought to do something, right? There comes the classic is-ought problem. Just because something is the case, how does it follow that I ought to or am obligated to do something in response? So stealing may be bad, but why am I obligated not to steal? To whom am I obligated? Just because I see a guy being robbed on a street corner, that's like that's the factual situation, why ought I to intervene or to call 911, right? What actually obligates me? Did those mere facts obligate me to intervene? So this is a problem for people who don't believe in God, right? If God doesn't provide moral obligations, then what does? How can facts about the world produce obligations? It doesn't seem really clear that that could be the case. So this is simply a special case of a rule that says you cannot conclude anything without related premises. So actually, all that language about what does ought mean is actually a little bit of a deeper issue. For example, I can't derive or conclude that something is red without ever mentioning the idea of red in any premises of this argument that I'm constructing. So for example, I say this car has a distinct color. This color is the same as an apple. Therefore, the car is red. That doesn't follow, right? Primarily because there's a missing premise, and that premise that we need to make this argument work is apples are red. So if I have the premise that apples are red, then I can make the argument work and say, yes, the car is red. Now, of course, I realize all apples aren't red, okay? But just go with the example for the sake of this argument. If apples are red and the car is the same color as an apple, the car is red. But notice I had to include the idea of red in the premise. Otherwise, the argument didn't work. This actually is the same with these ought type of conclusions, right? You cannot prove an ought claim, or some people call it a normative claim, without starting from a normative premise. Normative meaning it goes back to norm, what we should do, what we're expected to do, what is the norm, right? So for example, again, stealing is bad. A child's bicycle is being stolen. Therefore, you ought to intervene, right? Actually, that does not follow. There's a factual statement, another factual statement, but this obligation claim doesn't actually follow. Why? Because it's missing a premise. People ought to stop stealing if they see it happening. If that's true, then this would follow, right? Stealing is bad. A child's bicycle is being stolen. People ought to stop stealing if they see it happening, so therefore you ought to intervene. That now does follow because, again, we had to include a premise that had an ought in it. We couldn't just derive an ought from a bunch of is statements. We had to include a premise that had an ought in it. But here's the thing. Where do we get that premise from, right? We concluded a certain obligation here, but to conclude this obligation, we had to smuggle in this ought premise that actually didn't answer our question of where these oughts come from in the first place. So thus, every explanation, is or ought alike, must have some explanatory stopping point that is of the same nature as the conclusion, if you want the fancy philosophical way to describe that. Not so fast. What if a friend of mine said that he wanted to lose weight? A friend of mine, asking for a friend. And I reply, you ought to eat healthier and exercise more. Notice I said ought. You ought to eat healthier and exercise more. Is there an obligation here? If he wants to lose weight, then he ought to do X, Y, and Z. Couldn't this be the same for morality, right? If you want to do good, then you ought to do this. If human beings are to flourish, then you ought to, not rob people, not kill people, not steal, that, etc., right? So maybe oughts are merely just goal-directed behavior, as the objection goes. If this is the desired outcome, then this is how you achieve that. You ought to do it. But I would say, not quite. 3 problems with this that I see. 1, what if I don't want to? If I don't desire the outcome, then am I really obligated to do anything? 2, so, do I really have to care about human flourishing or just my own? 2, the statement, if I have a desire not to eat kale, then to achieve this desire, I ought not eat kale, is not an ought at all, but merely an is statement that's cloaked in ought terminology. So again, semantic games are kind of going on underneath the surface here. It is equivalent to saying, if I have a desire not to eat kale, the way to achieve this desire is that I don't eat kale. right? It's more just stating a matter of affairs, a state of facts, than it is generating an actual obligation, even though we use the ought word to describe it. So that doesn't imply that I have an obligation not to eat kale, but simply that not eating kale is factually the way to achieve my desire that was stated in the kind of the setup to that. In other words, it's the fallacy of equivocation, using the same word, but like a sleight of hand smuggling in a different meaning. And third, because of this, it can be easily parodied, right? So if my desire is to own slaves, then to achieve my desire, I ought to own slaves, right? That's kind of the same thing. We can parody what somebody's objection is by stating it in more stark moral terms. And of course, we do not have a moral obligation to own slaves.
You're a bad person. You're a bad person.
Anyway, anybody get that reference? No? Show called Community from like 2009. So sad. Okay, so our next objection is, why should we obey God? Also known as Ray Johnson's objection. Specifically that Ray Johnson right there. Everybody look at Ray Johnson. Okay. That's because he raised that in the question and answer period to Lance's talk last week, so I had to put that in there. Okay, why should we obey God's commands, right? So what is this objection? Well, let's revisit divine command theory a bit. Recall, God's commands are what generate our moral obligations. So the things that God commands, such as the Ten Commandments, right, are things that we ought to do, or we are obligated to do. So the clever student may ask, well, then what obligates us to keep God's commands? If God's commands are what obligate us to do other things, then what obligates us to keep God's commands? If God's commands generate our moral obligations, then what says we ought to obey God's commands in the first place? What generates that obligation? And as a professor of mine once said, know how you have those clever students? Don't you hate the clever students? They're like people on the yoga tapes that can do all the moves. Bums me out. So this actually goes back to a philosopher, non-Christian philosopher named G.E. Moore and his open question. And here's what he means by that. When you say that anything is good, then you have to ask, well, what makes that good? So for example, you shouldn't steal. I've been using that a lot tonight. Why? Well, because it harms someone. Why shouldn't we harm someone? Well, because it hinders human flourishing. Why is human flourishing good? And so on and so forth. Any because answer, it's good because of this, then you have to ask, well, why is that thing good? And why is that thing good? And why is that thing good? So eventually you'll have to reach a stopping point of some sort if you don't want an infinite regress, right? So what he's pointing out here is when you give a justification for why something is good or right or obligatory, that thing you use to justify it, you then have to justify that thing. So maybe God commands us to keep his commands.
Now, men, there are a few things we ought to get straightened out right at the start to avoid any grief later on. Now, here at The Rock, we have two basic rules. Memorize them so that you can say them in your sleep. The first rule is, obey all rules. Secondly, do not write on the walls, as it takes a lot of work to erase writing off of walls.
So again, what does he do? The first rule is obey all rules, right? That actually might not be as crazy as you think. Here's William Lane Craig. He says, the question doesn't even arise, why should I obey God's commands? Because that just is the theory. That is an explanatory ultimate that doesn't have a further explanation, right? Because as G.E. Moore said, eventually you have to reach something that can no longer be explained. So you can't just infinitely ask why, right? He says, we are to obey God's commands because God has commanded us to. That would not be viciously circular. For example, all of the things mentioned in the debate tonight is itself mentioned in the debate tonight. So there are things that are included in themselves. If God issues a command, you shall obey all of my commands, that command itself would be comprised in that command. Someone could say that if this answer is acceptable, then the following would also be an acceptable explanation, right? You're morally obligated to obey my commands because I command you to do so. That all depends on who is speaking in the first person. If it is God, then the theory is acceptable, but if it is a human being, the theory is utterly implausible, since it is not the paradigm of goodness who speaks, aka God, but a finite and morally imperfect being. The problem is not self-referentiality, but the nature of the source of moral value and duty. And there's the key line. The issue is the nature of the source of moral value and duty, aka it's about who God is. The thing that obligates us to obey God's commands is not something external to God, but rather could be simply the nature of God himself. We should obey God's commands because God, as love itself, should be loved, right? This would be consistent with the scripture, right? The one who does not love does not know God, for God is love. This would also be the exception to the is-ought rule, right? This fact about God, this is about him, would then generate our obligation to obey God. And that would be consistent also with like 1 John 5:3. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. There's this close connection, at least biblically consistent, between loving God and obeying God. Here's philosopher John Hare on this idea. He says, it is necessarily true that God is to be loved. We know this just by knowing the terms God and to be loved. This is because we know that if God exists, God is supremely good. And we know that what is supremely good is to be loved. It is also true that to love God is at least to obey God. If I justify moral obligations by saying that God's command makes things obligatory, I am not terminating the justification in something that itself requires justification, except in as far as I have to justify the claim that God exists. This means that divine commands do not generate all our obligations because there is one important exception, namely the obligation to obey divine commands. So what he's saying is that fact is grounded just in who God is. The fact that God exists and is the type of being that he is grounds that one obligation that then generates all the other ones. We could talk a little more about this by saying, okay, so the point is, this fact is grounded within God. It's not something external to God. That's the real problem, right? The real problem is if somebody else, some other authority outside of God told us, hey, you should obey God's commands. That would be a problem. But actually, the fact that we are to obey God's commands is itself grounded within God. God himself still remains the stopping point of all ultimate reality and, of course, all morality. So God's being tells us he should be loved, which means he should be obeyed. Nothing external to God is telling us that. No one else has to tell us to obey God. Another philosopher named C. Stephen Evans says, this is tantamount to saying that God, by nature of who he is, has authority. He is the creator of the universe. He owns everything and us. This gives him authority. Does a legislature have to make a law saying that you need to obey all the laws the legislature makes? It is simply the kind of thing with authority to make laws. That's just what a legislature is. So the authority of a legislature is separate from and prior to any laws that it passes. So similarly, God's authority by virtue of his own being and the fact that he created us and is separate from and prior to, the fact that he created us is itself, that fact, separate from and prior to any commands he might give us. Even if God doesn't give us commands, it would still be true, just based on who God is, that we should obey anything he were to command. Why should we obey God? Because of who he is, both as a brute reality and in relation to us. So that would kind of be my answer to the why should we obey God? What is that grounded in, right? It could still be grounded in God himself just by virtue of who God is. So that's be like one exception to like the can factual statements generate an ought claim, as we would argue. Another objection I call having your cake and eating it too. So what do I mean by that? Well, people who claim that, hey, we can have objective morality, but we don't need God in order to have objective morality.
Hey, Ron, you're not going to slaughter that pig here, are you?
Not to worry. I have a permit.
This just says I can do what I want.
Parks and Rec, anybody? Right? He has a permit, right? The permit is just self-referentially, I can do whatever I want, right? So that's not the most sophisticated theory of morality, but I would argue that some of them kind of do seem to boil down to, albeit humorous, something akin to that. But let's look at another example of somebody who kind of tries to base her claim to be an atheist on a morally related idea.
My name is Gabrielle Hinahara, and I'm an atheist because I believe in the power of doing good for the sake of doing good, and not because some divine entity tells you what is good and what's not, and not because you think it will get you into some sort of heavenly afterlife. I believe in human morality, which is why I think that most cultures across the world have come to the kind of same basic principles and values, such as the Golden Rule, which isn't based in religion, but is based in human interactions and mutual respect. And I think a lot of people turn to religion because it makes the choice of morality really easy, black and white, right and wrong, and you don't have to decide which is which. And in my experience as being an atheist through my life, I've found that moral choices are something that I think about a lot more than a lot of other people because nobody's telling me the answer. And since I don't believe in an afterlife, pretty much my whole meaning in life is based on my interactions with other people and that I can leave this world a better place by my actions.
So she makes a lot of interesting claims in that video, and I will admit that she's not like the gold standard example of like, you know, atheistic or non-theistic moral philosophers who have opinions on this. She's more of a popular level voice who's kind of more speaking off the cuff. But I wanted to show that because it caught my ear when I happened across that, because she's making a distinctly moral claim. And I do also know that she's making it kind of based on practical grounds a little bit. But if you recall some of the things she said, that's our next discussion question. How would you respond to the claims based on morality that she makes in that video? Probably the two critiques I'd have of her presentation there overall would be, one is that she seems to be operating on some kind of a facile or straw man type view of religion or Christianity in general and just how that functions with respect to morality. I think she's kind of got this like, well, you know, in religion or in Christianity, God just says, here's how it is, and then that's how it is, and then that kind of takes any decision making out of it, right? She kind of complains about that and says, you know, as an atheist, I can just think about these things for myself. I don't have to, you know, because someone said so. And I think that's kind of a bit of a straw man in that she's almost assuming kind of that God doesn't exist, and therefore any rules that religions create are just something that people a long time ago came up with, and therefore I have to be bound by some, you know, old person who wrote 2,000 years ago, and I can't think for myself. So I think there's a little bit of that baked in. Her objections are also a little bit practical, you know, in that sense, and they kind of boil down to like, well, I want to think about these questions, but she kind of seems to gloss over the fact that there is no standard, right? You take out God, what are you basing this on? Like, what is the point of arguing? So it kind of goes back to that moral disagreement. Doesn't make a lot of sense if you don't have some kind of a standard that you can point to. And so she's certainly very adamant about cutting herself off from a standard, but she doesn't really offer us anything in place of the standard that she rejects to substitute as like another kind of North Star that we can all point to and say, here's how we know what morality is. It's not based on me. So she doesn't really offer us that in that video. And again, I'm not putting forward like, here is the objection, but just as kind of like a more popular level. You'll hear people claim to, you know, be a non-theist based on certain moral reasons, and I think if you dig down a little deeper, you can see that that kind of functions as a rejection of the moral argument, but I don't think it's well-founded. However, I use that to introduce several, I'm going to call them alternate, quote-unquote, godless theories, meaning theories that claim to establish some type of objective morality, but that don't need God. It's kind of like that famous line that the mathematician Laplace is supposed to have said, right, when questioned about, you know, well, where is God in your mathematical theory? And he's like, I have no need of that hypothesis, right? That's kind of what we're trying to do here with some of these alternate theories, is like, hey, here's how you could have objective morality, but without God. And I'm going to argue that I think they're all insufficient, or at least the ones I bring up. So recall premise 2 of that deductive argument, right? If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. So some people would push back on this premise by proposing alternate theories, right, usually more sophisticated than Gabrielle's there in that video, that say we can have objective morality, but we don't need God. And I would say there's two main categories of these theories, and I don't have time to cover every jot and tittle and technicality of everything that's been proposed, but here's just kind of a very broad, quick overview of some of the options that are out there. So two main categories would be like realist theories, right? Moral truths actually exist. They are fixed apart from perspectives, ideas, and thoughts. So in other words, morality is objective and real in some sense. There's also what are considered like constructivist theories. So that would be like moral truths are created and fixed. So there's some objectivity here through some sort of process arising from groups of people or idealized perspectives. There's some kind of a construction of morality that happens either over time or through various people or groups of people, and that's what produces some sense of objectivity within morality. So it's more of a softer claim. We'll start with some type of realist theory. So there's a realist theory called Cornell Realism, and that's just kind of a fancy way because it developed from some professors at Cornell University originally, but it's basically saying, look, moral facts operate analogously to scientific facts and thus can be discovered in scientific ways. Like the classic example is like being healthy, right? Morality can be discovered like ways to be healthy can be discovered, or goodness is like healthiness. That's kind of the fundamental claim. Think morality is scientifically determined. So just like we determine scientific facts, so we can determine moral facts. Again, kind of see a little bit of the goal-directed behavior here, right? Because they brought up like healthiness. What to do? If I want to be healthy, I ought to do this, right? But it goes a little bit deeper than that because they're saying you can actually derive these moral truths from science in some way. And I think one way to push back on this a little bit is this thought experiment called the moral twin earth objection. This gets a little heady because it's a big hypothetical. But basically what it says is we would end up using the same terms to mean different things. So Let me see if I can describe this really quickly. So let's say we have Earth, like one of the most important substances on Earth is water, right? It's in a whole bunch of stuff. We have oceans filled with it. We drink it. We rely on it to survive, right? What if there was some other Earth, some other twin Earth, some other planet, where the people lived very similarly to what we do, so it's populated, but they had some substance called XYZ, but for them it functioned like water, right? It was in all their oceans. It was in all their taps. They drank it. They relied on it to survive. All these different things. It rained this XYZ substance, but on that planet, this thing that they called water and operated functionally like water on this planet was not actually H2O. It wasn't two hydrogens and an oxygen, right? So let's say we have that kind of, scientific difference going on here. They call it water, and it functions like water, but chemically it's not actually water. Okay. Now picture, again, these two Earths, but let's cast the claim in a moral lens. So let's say on Earth we have certain terms like right and wrong and good and evil, and we use those in certain ways. Let's say that on this other Earth, the development of that planet and those people scientifically has just kind of led to them using these right and wrong, good and evil terms, but in respect to different things. So we could say like, hey, let's assume that on our Earth, everybody just broadly agreed that the correct answer to the trolley problem is to pull the lever. That is the right option, pull the lever, right? But let's say that the scientific development, you could even say evolution of this other planet, they thought that the right answer to the trolley problem was to not pull the lever and do nothing. That was the correct answer to the trolley problem on this twin Earth, right? So we call pulling the lever right. They call not pulling the lever right. So the question is, when you compare the water example, right, they call it water, we call it water, but it's actually a different chemical substance. We say pulling the lever on the trolley is right. They say not pulling the lever is right. Are those two disagreements similar and analogous, right? One's kind of a scientific difference, and if the proposal of Cornell Realism that morality is very similar to science, moral facts are similar to scientific facts, is the second one about whether to pull the lever or not. Is that the same type of disagreement? Is that just a scientific disagreement, so they're just using the word right for different things? Or would we actually more accurately say that there's a moral disagreement going on between the people who live on this Earth and the people who live on this twin Earth, right? It's a bit heady, it's a hypothetical, but what it's saying is, look, no, there's a difference, right? We wouldn't just say, oh, they're just using the word right in different ways, right? Like we would say, oh, they're just using the word water to describe two different chemical substances, like the scientific claim. The analogous moral claim doesn't make a lot of sense. We wouldn't say, oh, they're just using the word right in different ways. We'd say, no, they actually have a moral disagreement. For whatever reason, there's something deeper going on than just a scientific reality. So that's kind of one of these thought experiments that I think does a good job at kind of poking the hole in what's wrong with Cornell Realism, or the claim that, fancy name for it, morality comes from science. So in other words, from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, he says, we do not use moral terms in the way that Cornell Realist predicts. In other words, they predict that we should use terms like that water. We both call it water, but it has different chemical substances versus, we both call one action right and one action wrong, and it's the opposite on this other planet, but actually the disagreement is moral, not just scientific. So anyway, it kind of seems to collapse then into a form of relativism, right? If we do not use the moral terms in the way that Cornell Realist predicts, they call this right, different planet calls something else, or the opposite action right. Well, who's to say? Again, we kind of get into this planet relativism, if you will. So I think Cornell Realism actually lacks in that sense and just kind of becomes another form of subjectivism. Another type of realism, again, atheists arguing that morality actually does exist and doesn't need God, would be something that's sometimes called robust realism or non-naturalism. This is to say that moral facts actually exist in some sort of Platonic way. Now, that just means in some sort of abstract way. So the reason it says Platonic is because Plato had these ideas of these forms. The form of the beautiful and the form of the good were standards against which you could compare things to see if they're beautiful or good, right? So robust realists would say, hey, moral facts actually exist in some sort of Platonic way. Think about it like this. Erik Wielenberg has a notable theory in this regard, and he would say that morality comes from brute ethical facts that exist much like the facts of mathematics. So think like 3 + 4 = 7. That's a fact that exists, right? And so he would claim that moral facts are very similar to like mathematical facts. They just exist as facts. And we all recognize that those mathematical facts exist, and we don't ask what grounds them, right? We don't generally say like, well, 3 + 4 = 7. Well, what makes 3 + 4 = 7? Or why does 3 + 4 = 7? Or by what authority does 3 + 4 = 7? We don't ask that kind of question. So Wielenberg proposes that moral facts exist in the same way. Why can't we just have the same thing with moral facts? We don't ask what grounds moral facts or by what authority do moral facts exist. They just exist. They're brute ethical facts. So Wielenberg says that these facts become applicable to human beings by something he calls the making relationship, whereby facts about circumstances in the world cause moral facts to become applicable to certain situations or to be instantiated, if you want to get fancy. So natural, I think natural world, non-moral properties, just statements of fact, is statements, cause moral properties to apply to specific situations. That's what he's claiming here. So his classic example, right? There's a child that is on fire. There's a bucket of water nearby. These natural facts cause your moral obligation to put out that fire to be instantiated or to come to apply to you in that situation. So essentially, he's kind of denying the is-ought distinction. He's basically arguing, no, is facts can generate an ought. That's what he's saying. So, robust realism critique. So how would I respond to this? And again, I just scratched the surface. He wrote a whole book on this. There's a whole bunch more technicality you could go into. But here's how I'd critique his idea, and it would go something like this. In his theory that there's all these different brute ethical facts, these moral facts that just exist, like a whole bunch of mathematical facts, we need to believe in all these facts for this theory to hold. So like, what evidence first is there that all of these brute ethical facts exist, right? What is the evidence that points to the existence of these objects? And he would say, well, there really isn't any. They're just the best explanation, as he would argue, for why morality exists. So there's lots of non-natural things in his theory that need to exist, things like these facts that just exist outside of the world in some abstract way. So why not, I would say, just believe in God, right? A single being that is the source of all morality, whose existence arguably has direct evidence, as we sometimes argue with other arguments for God's existence, rather than a bunch of unexplained facts. So I would make kind of a parsimony or an Occam's razor. The simplest explanation might be true, that we have one divine being who's the source of morality, not just a bunch of ethical facts that exist abstractly. Second, this making relationship, how we become obligated, depends, I would say, too much on the uniformity of our cognitive faculties. So, of course, you know, there's all kinds of differentiation in human experience, right? Sometimes there's people who have mental disabilities, and so the question arises like, well, how are people actually obligated if we have to cognize these certain facts about our existence, and that causes our moral obligations to attach to us? The process seems kind of fraught and difficult to explain. And then lastly, one of the strongest ones, I think, is sometimes called the lucky coincidence objection, meaning how did it come to be the case if, as somebody like Wielenberg, who believes in evolution, would say, you know, that's how we came to be, there was no God guiding the process, right? It was just purely naturalistic evolution, right? If that's the case, how did it come to be that our moral beliefs match the objective reality of these brute ethical facts, or these moral facts that exist external to our world, right? Because those external facts can't really cause anything. And when evolution has formed our beliefs, our cognitive faculties to make certain judgments, how did it come to be the case that the path of evolution, which just kind of goes along as it goes along, it's not guided by anybody or anything in the naturalistic paradigm, how did it end up that we just sort of discovered what these moral properties are, even though there was no person or being or process to really guide us there? Because like, evolution is haphazard, it's arbitrary, it's unguided, it's naturalistic. So if that's how we came to be, isn't it kind of just a lucky coincidence that our beliefs actually match what objective morality really is? And I didn't include it here. There's actually a famous Darwin quote that kind of talks about like, well, if we had been evolved the same way bees evolved, then our morality would be much different. It would resemble that of honeybees, right? So there's kind of this unanswered question of like, how exactly can a process like evolution, how it operates, really produce beliefs that correspond to something, unless some type of being exists that you could say gives us those moral beliefs or guides evolution or something. Without God, how is that possible? So that's kind of one of the critiques of this kind of robust realism, this claim that we can have objective morality without God. To give a little bit of overview of what the constructivist theories are like, these are kind of more of a hybrid, I would say. So one of them you could say like Kantianism, Immanuel Kant, sometimes called deontology. Basically, moral truth is constructed out of a particular person's rational will, or sometimes called the categorical imperative. Basically, kind of reasoning morality out by saying, well, what would it be like if everyone did this, right? What would be the consequence if everyone did this, and then I should kind of act accordingly with these universal laws? So I kind of construct morality in that deontological way. Or another option is contractarianism. Moral truth is constructed from rules of deliberators in specific circumstances or contracts. That kind of says like, hey, the various moral deliberations we've had throughout history, these kind of contractual, not strictly legal, but kind of these relationships we've had as human beings kind of came to define a lot of what we see as morality in somewhat of an objective sense. there's like ideal observer theories. Maybe moral truth comes from the perspective of a hypothetical ideal observer. If an ideal person who wasn't biased and who didn't have selfishness was observing what we do, what would they think? And that's maybe what morality is. Or an ideal agent, right? Moral truth comes from the perspective of some hypothetical idealized participant in the moral situation, very similar to the idealized observer. So these are some just examples of different constructivist moral theories, saying we can have some sense of objectivity with morality, and we don't need God to do that. So how would I critique these kind of theories? Well, the problem with constructivism is that it's kind of a hybrid position, like I said, between what we would call truly objective or real, realism might be the better term, or subjective. So it tries in various ways to abstract moral decisions away from particular human beings, but there's really still no there, right? There's no being commanding us to do things. There's no actual facts. It's more just kind of like morality arises from these idealized situations or something similar. So in other words, we can only get these ideal observers is through our own real physical selves, right? Since morality is constructed from hypotheticals, it's still really not quite rising to the level of an objective fact. In other words, who gets to say what the ideal observer would think? We can kind of think of all these qualifiers like, well, they'd be a rational person, they'd be unbiased, they'd be not selfish, kind of these kind of qualifiers, but who really gets to decide what the ideal observer actually thinks? Is that a stable foundation for morality? And I would argue that it's probably not. So I kind of did a drive-by of constructivism. There's a whole bunch more you could read up on, but just for time's sake, we don't have time to go into all that tonight. But anyway, I kind of want to just give a taste of some of these alternate theories that try to say, hey, we can have morality and we don't need God to have it. That's the core of the moral argument, that we, in order to have objective morality, we need to have some type of being like God to ground it and to make it actually obligatory for us to follow it. So if we don't have any of these alternate theories of morality that work, because I would argue they don't, and if none of these objections to the moral argument succeed, all we're left with without God then would be subjectivism, right? So things like relativism. Morality is culturally determined and comes from different social conventions. Or something that's called error theory, right? That would just hold that there actually is no moral reality. We may have beliefs about morality, but these are all an evolutionary illusion, right? We think things are right and wrong, but that's just because it helps us in how we live. It doesn't actually represent reality. Or prescriptivism. Moral statements are simply things we want other people to do. So saying murder is wrong in this system is just the same as saying do not murder. So saying, murder is wrong, that's actually not a moral claim as much as it is like an imperative. I want you not to murder, so that's what I'm saying when I say murder is wrong. Or expressivism, right? Moral statements are merely a way to express an evaluative attitude. For example, our emotional reaction to something. So under this system, if I said murder is wrong, all that means is I don't like murder, right? That doesn't actually mean something more moral, that just means I have a distaste for murder. Or something like, say, boo, murder, right? That's kind of what that amounts to a little bit, the emotivist form of expressivism. So if we don't have any alternate theories that really work to describe morality without God, and if we don't have God, I would argue that all that remains is this kind of the sifting sands of subjectivism. And I go back to the method for my madness about talking about how do you pronounce Ratio Christi, right? What's the correct way to pronounce Ratio Christi? Well, there actually is no truly correct way, right? Because phonics has come to be developed through our use of language in the past. When people have decided certain sounds are associated with certain letters and how things should be pronounced in that sense. So yeah, there kind of is a right answer based on the history of our language and the history of that development, but at the root of it, it's not the same type of claim as 3 + 4 = 7. There's not an absolute thing. You could talk about maybe we just pronounce it because people in the past decided it was that way, some kind of contractarianism thing, and we just agree with that convention. It all just boils down to some type of similar convention. If we don't have God who can ground morality and who can make us actually obligated to obey the things that morality would tell us to do, I would argue that it basically boils down to something that's just convention-based. That maybe we can point to somewhat of an agreement amongst a culture or amongst certain people in the past, or other ways that we might feel about how things should be pronounced. But at the end of the day, if I want to pronounce it Ratio Christ, who are you to stop me, right? So that was kind of the method of my madness with the humor from the beginning, was that if the moral argument doesn't work, and if, as I argue, these other alternate theories don't work, subjectivism is ultimately what we're left with, which I think is a very unsatisfying view when we're talking about claims like you shouldn't murder, right? You shouldn't steal, you shouldn't rape, right? Those are important moral claims. We seem to be arguing about those things in a way that's objective, not that's subjective. So with that, recommendations. If you want to go deeper with this subject area, I would recommend the Convincing Proof YouTube channel, because there's a series of videos on there that we actually recorded at Ratio Christi about 4 years ago that just kind of walks through a lot more of this meta-ethical stuff in more detail. So it's a whole playlist, and it's probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours long. So if you want to spend that time, you can do that. There's a book called A Debate on God and Morality, where William Lane Craig actually debated Erik Wielenberg about his theory of morality, that robust realism, right, versus Craig's divine command theory. That's a bit technical and philosophical, but it's out there, and it has some interesting back and forth interaction in it. Just a website called moralapologetics.com. You can find a lot of interesting resources relating to defending the moral argument there. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. Mere Christianity and Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. So actually, Mere Christianity, Lewis makes a very kind of interesting formulation of the moral argument in the opening chapters of that book. And then I mentioned Abolition of Man from before because he catalogs a lot of different moralities from different cultures in the appendix to that book. And it's also just a very good book in and of itself. And then finally, there's a YouTube video out there also on the Convincing Proof channel called Does the Existence of God Help Explain Moral Knowledge by David Baggett. That's also kind of technical. He's a speaker we invited to Ratio Christi several years ago, and some people still have PTSD from that talk. But if you want some of the more specifics, especially about evolutionary arguments and as they relate to morality, he talks about that. And so with that, thank you.